"Shut your mouth, girl. You think you can just walk in here and demand respect?" The words hit like a slap, sharp and cutting. The smell of smoke filled the small, dimly lit interrogation room as the officer leaned back in his chair, the glowing tip of his cigar dangerously close to her face. She flinched but didn't look away. Her wrists, raw from the handcuffs, rested heavily on the table, but her eyes, those eyes, refused to break. "You people never learn, do you?" The officer's voice was low, steady, dripping with contempt. He leaned closer, the ember of his cigar nearly brushing her cheek. "This isn't your world. It never was, and it never will be." The heat singed the edge of her skin. She squeezed her eyes shut, swallowing the scream rising in her throat. But the pain was real. So was the rage. It started hours earlier, a routine traffic stop, nothing out of the ordinary. At least that's what it should have been. Instead, it spiraled into accusations, insults, and handcuffs, all because of the color of her skin. She had tried to reason with them, tried to explain. But logic didn't matter. Her words fell on deaf ears. "Shut up before I give you something to cry about," one of the officers snapped, shoving her into the back of the squad car. By the time they reached the station, the humiliation had already set in. The stares, the smirks, the whispers, they had stripped away every layer of dignity she tried to hold on to. Now, in this room, with the sharp sting of smoke in her nostrils and the cruel glint in his eyes, she felt the full weight of their power crushing down on her. "Do you understand now?" the officer sneered. "Do you see what happens when people like you step out of line?" Her skin burned, not just from the ember, but from the fire building inside her. She wanted to scream, to fight, to break free. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not here. Instead, she locked eyes with him and let the silence stretch. It wasn't defeat. It was calculation. "You'll regret this," she whispered. The officer laughed, loud and bitter. "Regret? The only thing I regret is not doing this sooner." He ground the cigar into the table, ashes scattering like dust. But there was something he didn't know. Behind those cuffs, behind the bruises and the scars, she wasn't just another victim. She wasn't just another name in his long list of people he'd broken. She was something he hadn't anticipated. And before the night was over, the balance of power would shift. He didn't see it coming. Not when he called her trash. Not when he shoved her against the wall. Not even when he spat on her shoes and told her to remember her place. But she saw it. Because she knew something he didn't. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. The beginning of something that would leave the entire department reeling. The beginning of justice. The question was, when the truth came out, when the tables turned, would he be able to face what was coming for him? Or would the weight of his own actions crush him before the world even had the chance? And when it was over, when his career, his reputation, and his future went up in flames, would he even recognize the woman he tried to destroy? Because by the time the sun rose, she wouldn't be the same woman who had walked through those doors in handcuffs. And he wouldn't be the man who walked out. So the only question left is, who would survive the night? Hello, dear listeners. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to you, especially to our Black audience. Here at Plow of Twist, we firmly stand against racism, discrimination, and any form of injustice. This channel is a safe space where powerful stories unfold to inspire change, resilience, and hope. We believe in equality, respect, and fairness, and today's story highlights the importance of standing up against abuse of power. Thank you for being here with us. Your voice matters, your story matters. Now, sit back and enjoy this emotional roller coaster. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button to keep supporting impactful content like this. Enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above the narrow, windowless room. The walls were painted a dull shade of gray, cracked and stained in the corners, as if decades of smoke and sweat had seeped into the concrete. It smelled of stale coffee and something metallic, blood, maybe, or just rusted metal handcuffs that had been used one too many times. It was the kind of room where people left pieces of themselves behind. On the other side of the table sat Avery Daniels, her wrists cuffed and resting heavily on the cold metal surface. Her dark brown skin glistened under the harsh light, beads of sweat trailing down her temples. She had been in this room for hours now, silent, staring straight ahead, her breathing shallow but steady. Avery wasn't the type to panic, not even now. Her upbringing had hardened her. Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, she had learned early on that survival didn't come from tears, it came from control. From staying calm even when everything inside her screamed. She had done everything right, gone to school, earned her degree, and built a career in law enforcement that most people would have called impossible for someone like her. But Avery never believed in impossible. She'd spent years proving people wrong. Now, sitting in this room, cuffed and stripped of her dignity, she fought to hold on to the version of herself that didn't break under pressure. Across the table, leaning back in his chair, was Detective Richard Hale. He was a heavy-set man in his early 40s, with a buzzed haircut that made his square jaw look even more severe. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, the top button undone, and his badge hung crookedly from his chest. Everything about him exuded arrogance. Richard had been with the force for nearly 2 decades, and he carried himself like he owned every inch of the station. To him, Avery wasn't a person, she was a lesson. A reminder of where the real power lay. He took another puff from the cigar he'd been holding for the past hour, letting the smoke swirl around the room as he eyed her with something between amusement and disgust. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I've seen all kinds walk through those doors." He gestured vaguely toward the hall outside. "Drug dealers, thieves, gangbangers. They all have the same look in their eyes, fear. But you?" He smirked. "You just don't know when to quit." Avery didn't flinch, though her jaw tightened. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You think you're special? You think walking in here with your head held high means something? It doesn't. Not here." She refused to look away. She had faced men like him before, men who thought power gave them the right to treat others like dirt. But there was something different about Richard. He enjoyed this. The room felt smaller with him in it, the walls pressing closer. His words lingered like smoke, heavy and suffocating. "Why don't you just say it?" Avery finally spoke, her voice low but steady. "Say what you really mean." Richard raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" She leaned forward just enough to make him shift slightly. "You hate that I'm here. That I exist in your world. That I don't fit into whatever box you think people like me are supposed to stay in." The smirk faded. "Careful," he said, his voice sharper now. "You're walking a fine line." "No," she shot back. "You are." The words hung between them for a long moment, until Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't get it, do you?" He circled the table slowly, his heavy boots echoing with each step. "This isn't about race or politics or whatever nonsense you're telling yourself to sleep at night. This is about respect. And you clearly don't have any." She followed him with her eyes, her heart pounding, but her expression never wavered. Richard stopped behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body. "So let me make this clear," he said, lowering his voice. "You're nothing in here. Nothing. And the sooner you accept that, the easier this'll be." He stepped closer, and she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Because the only thing worse than a woman who doesn't know her place," he said, "is one who thinks she's above it." Avery's breath hitched as she felt the heat near her cheek, the ember of the cigar just inches from her skin. Her muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at her to move, to fight, to scream. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she let him see it, the defiance burning in her eyes. You're going to regret this, she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Richard chuckled, pulling back just enough to make her think the moment was over, only to suddenly press the burning tip closer. The searing pain tore through her skin, and she bit down hard, refusing to give him the satisfaction of hearing her scream. He pulled away, grinning as he flicked ashes onto the floor. That's the problem with you people, he said. Always so sure you can change the rules. But in the end, the rules always win. The door swung open suddenly, and another officer poked his head inside. Hey, Hale, we've got a call. He froze, eyes darting between them. What's going on in here? Richard straightened, stepping back like nothing had happened. Nothing. Just putting her in her place. The officer hesitated but eventually nodded, leaving as quickly as he'd come. Avery's skin throbbed, but she didn't let herself break. Not in front of him. Not ever. Because deep down, she knew something Richard didn't. She wasn't here by accident. And she wasn't leaving in cuffs. Not tonight. Not ever. The overhead lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows that stretched across the gray concrete floor of the holding cell. The room smelled like stale sweat and disinfectant, a harsh combination that clung to the walls and seeped into the air. Avery Daniels sat on the narrow bench bolted to the wall, her wrists finally free from the cuffs but still raw, faint red marks circling her skin. Her fingers twitched slightly, but it wasn't from nerves. It was the rage, still simmering beneath the surface, waiting to explode. She kept her breathing steady, but every sharp inhale felt like fire against her lungs. Her reflection in the small, scratched window of the door barely looked like her anymore. The burn on her cheek had begun to blister, an angry red mark that felt like it was pulsing with heat. But it wasn't the pain that consumed her, it was the humiliation. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, growing louder until they stopped just outside the door. Avery straightened, her shoulders stiff, her eyes focused. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. Officer Malik Harris stepped inside, his uniform slightly rumpled and his dark brown eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. Pity? Worry? Fear? She didn't trust any of it. You all right? His voice was soft, barely more than a whisper. Avery didn't respond right away. She wanted to trust the question, but trust wasn't something she gave easily, especially not here, not now. Do I look all right? Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. Malik winced but held his ground. I saw what he did. Her jaw tightened. And you let it happen. I couldn't stop him, Malik said, stepping closer but keeping his voice low. You don't know what this place is like. She narrowed her eyes. Oh, I think I know exactly what it's like. No, he said firmly, glancing toward the hallway. Hale runs this station. Always has. He's got half the guys here in his pocket, and the rest are too scared to speak up. And you? Avery's voice was sharp. Malik's lips pressed together. I'm not proud of it, all right. But I'm not him. Then prove it. Before Malik could respond, the door swung open again. Detective Richard Hale stepped inside, his broad shoulders filling the room. He looked smug, his lips curling into that same infuriating smirk. Harris, Hale said, his voice low and cold. What exactly do you think you're doing in here? Malik straightened. Checking on the detainee. Not your job, Hale snapped. Get out. Malik hesitated for just a second before backing out of the room, his eyes lingering on Avery for a fraction too long before the door slammed shut behind him. Hale took his time, circling the room like a predator sizing up its prey. He dropped a manila folder onto the table, the contents spilling slightly as it slid toward her. Take a look, he said, leaning back against the wall. Avery didn't touch it. What is this? Your record, Hale said with a grin. Or what's about to be your record? Resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, should I keep going? Her stomach tightened, but she didn't let it show. You're bluffing. Am I? He stepped closer. See, the funny thing about working here is I don't have to bluff. Avery met his eyes. You think you've won? Hale's grin widened. No. I know I have. The door opened suddenly, and Captain Roy Edwards stepped inside. His presence immediately changed the energy in the room. Older, with graying temples and sharp eyes, Roy carried authority in every movement. Hale, Roy said, his voice steady but firm. A word. Hale's smirk faded slightly, but he stepped outside, leaving Avery alone with Roy. She stared at him, waiting for whatever excuse he was about to give. Are you hurt? He asked. Her eyes narrowed. Do you care? Roy exhaled slowly. We need to talk. But not here. Then where? Roy hesitated. Follow me. The hallway outside was quieter than she expected. Most of the desks were empty, and the air felt heavier, like something was about to break. Roy led her into his office and shut the door behind her. You're in trouble, he said. No kidding. Roy rubbed his temples. I know what Hale did. I know what he's capable of. And you let it happen. Roy's jaw tightened. It's complicated. No, it's not. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, she saw something unexpected, guilt. This department isn't as clean as you think, Roy said. Hale isn't the only problem. Then fix it. It's not that simple. It is if you make it. Roy leaned forward, lowering his voice. You don't know what you're up against. Avery didn't flinch. Neither do they. Roy hesitated, but there was something in her tone that made him pause. You're free to go, he finally said. Her heart skipped, but she didn't let it show. Roy opened the door, and Avery stepped past him without hesitation. She didn't know what her next move was, but one thing was clear, this wasn't over. Not even close. She walked past the rows of desks, her footsteps steady despite the storm raging inside her. Officers looked up as she passed, some avoiding her gaze, others staring openly. She felt every set of eyes, every unspoken word. Hale wasn't in sight, but his presence lingered, like smoke that refused to clear. Avery reached the exit and pushed through the doors, stepping out into the cold night air. The sky above was dark, heavy with clouds. She pulled in a shaky breath, the cool air stinging her lungs. She wasn't walking away from this. She was walking toward it. Because Hale thought he had the upper hand. But he was wrong. He didn't know who she really was. Not yet. The sound of footsteps pounded against the tile floor, each step heavier than the last. Avery stood in the dimly lit office, her pulse hammering so hard it almost drowned out the noise. She didn't flinch, didn't turn, but her entire body tensed as the door creaked open. The heavy scent of tobacco filled the room before she even saw him. Hale stepped inside, his broad frame blocking most of the light from the hallway. He closed the door behind him slowly, the soft click of the latch echoing through the tense silence. His lips curved into that same smug smirk she'd seen before, the one that made her stomach churn. But there was something different this time. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Avery saw it. Doubt. You're still here, Hale said, his voice dripping with condescension, but there was a crack in it, faint but unmistakable. I'm not going anywhere, Avery replied, her voice steady, deliberate. Hale leaned back against the door, crossing his arms like he owned the space. You should be thanking me, you know. Could have been a lot worse for you. Avery didn't move. She kept her eyes locked on his, refusing to give him even an inch. Is that supposed to scare me? His smirk twitched. No. That's supposed to remind you who's in charge here. She took a step closer, her heart pounding, but her voice didn't waver. Not anymore. Hale's face darkened, the amusement draining from his features. You think one bad night changes anything? You think you can walk out of here and take me down? I don't think, Avery said. I know. Before Hale could respond, the door swung open, and Captain Roy Edwards stepped inside. Behind him came Malik, followed by two other officers. The room, which had felt suffocating just seconds earlier, suddenly felt even smaller. What the hell is this? Hale snapped, his voice rising. Roy stepped forward, his face grim. Detective Richard Hale, you're under arrest. Hale froze. For the first time since Avery had met him, he looked genuinely caught off guard. You're joking, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Roy didn't blink. Assault. Abuse of power. Falsifying evidence. Obstruction of justice. Need me to keep going? Hale's face reddened. You can't prove any of that. Malik stepped forward, holding up a small flash drive. Actually, we can. The color drained from Hale's face as his eyes locked on the drive. You set me up. No, Malik said. You set yourself up. We just didn't look the other way this time. Avery stepped closer, her voice sharp. You thought you could bury me. Burn me. But you forgot one thing. Hale turned to her, his teeth clenched. And what's that? I don't break. The words cut through the air like a blade. Hale's shoulders tensed, his breathing quickening as he tried to process what was happening. This is a mistake, he said, his voice quieter now. You're all making a big mistake. Roy's expression didn't change. No, Hale. The mistake was thinking you could get away with this. The officers behind him moved in, grabbing Hale's arms. He jerked back, but their grip tightened. You can't do this. Hale shouted. You're ruining my career. You did that yourself, Avery said coldly, stepping back as the officers secured the cuffs around his wrists. Hale turned to her, desperation cutting through his anger. You don't understand what you're doing. Oh, I understand perfectly, Avery said, her voice steady. You built this place on fear. But fear only works until someone stops being afraid. Hale's eyes bore into hers, wild and panicked. You'll regret this, he hissed as they began to drag him toward the door. Avery didn't flinch. No. You will. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving the room heavy with silence. Avery let out a slow breath, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. She clenched and unclenched her fists, willing the tremor in her hands to stop. Malik stepped closer, his voice softer now. You okay? Avery didn't look at him right away. She stared at the spot where Hale had stood just moments earlier, letting the weight of what had just happened settle in. I will be, she finally said. Roy cleared his throat. You should know it's not over. Avery turned to him. It's a start. He nodded, but there was hesitation in his eyes. Be careful. People like him don't go down quietly. She met his gaze. Neither do I. The hum of voices outside grew louder as they stepped out into the main office. Officers clustered in small groups, their whispers carrying across the room. Eyes darted toward Avery, some filled with curiosity, others with doubt, and a few with something she couldn't quite name. She didn't care. She walked past them all, her step steady despite the storm still raging inside her. The weight of their stares didn't touch her. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here to lead. As she pushed through the front doors and stepped outside, the cold night air hit her face, sharp and bracing. She pulled in a deep breath, letting it clear the fog in her mind. The sting of the burn on her cheek was still there, a dull reminder of everything that had happened. But it wasn't the pain that she carried with her, it was the fire. This wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of something bigger. Because Hale wasn't the only one who had to answer for his actions. And Avery Daniels wasn't finished yet. Not even close. Avery stood in the middle of the station, the hum of whispers filling the space around her. Eyes trailed her every move, some curious, others sharp with judgment. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. Malik walked beside her, his shoulders tense as they made their way toward the interrogation rooms. The weight of what had just happened lingered like smoke in the air, but Avery wasn't done. Not yet. Are you sure about this? Malik asked, his voice low. Absolutely. Avery didn't slow her pace. He's dangerous, Avery. You saw it yourself. She stopped, turning to face him. And I'm not. Malik hesitated, then shook his head. That's not what I meant. Then don't start doubting me now. Her voice was sharp but steady. He exhaled and nodded, stepping aside to let her lead. The metal door to the holding cell screeched as it opened. Hale sat inside, his wrists cuffed to the table. His eyes snapped up the moment she stepped in, and the tension in the room thickened. You again, he said, leaning back in his chair, forcing a smirk. Come to gloat. Avery shut the door behind her and stepped closer. No. I came to finish this. Hale's smirk faltered for a moment before he straightened, masking the crack in his composure. You think you've won? You think dragging me out of here in cuffs means something? It means everything. He scoffed. You're just like the rest of them, desperate for power, for control. But you're not built for this world. Avery leaned over the table, closing the space between them. Neither are you. Hale's jaw tensed. You don't get it, do you? You're fighting a losing battle. They're not going to protect you when this is over. They're not going to stand by you. I don't need them to, Avery snapped. I'm not standing here because someone let me. I'm standing here because I earned it. Hale's eyes flickered with something, fear, maybe, or anger so sharp it was eating him alive. You're delusional, he spat. No, I'm prepared, Avery countered. I've spent my entire life preparing for this moment, for people like you who think they can tear others down and never face the consequences. Hale yanked at his cuffs, the chains rattling against the table. You think this is over? I still have friends in this station, people who won't let this stand. They're not coming for you, she said. You made sure of that when you burned every bridge you had. His breathing quickened, the first real crack in his armor showing as the weight of her words settled over him. They'll bury you, he hissed. No, Avery said softly, her voice cutting through his panic. You already buried yourself. For the first time, Hale looked smaller, the fight in him dimming just enough for her to see the fear underneath. You were so focused on breaking people, Avery continued, that you never saw what was coming. You thought no one would fight back. But I did. And now you're sitting in the same chair you put so many others in. Tell me, how does it feel? Hale's eyes darted away, and the silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. You can't undo this, he said finally, his voice quieter now. You can't fix what's broken here. Avery's jaw tightened. Watch me. Hale let out a bitter laugh. You think putting me away changes anything? There's 100 more just like me. You can't clean up this place. Maybe not overnight, Avery said. But someone has to start. Hale leaned forward, his voice dropping. And what happens when the next one comes after you? When they decide to put you in this chair? Avery didn't flinch. Let them try. The door opened, and Roy stepped inside, his face unreadable as he looked between them. It's time. Avery straightened, her gaze never leaving Hale's. This isn't over, Hale said, but there was no weight behind the words anymore. For you, it is, Avery replied before turning and walking out of the room. Roy fell into step beside her as they moved through the station. "He's not wrong," he said after a moment. "You've made enemies tonight." "Good," Avery said without hesitation. "That means I'm doing something right." Roy slowed, forcing her to stop and face him. "You're not invincible, Avery." "I never said I was," she replied. "But I'm not scared of this fight. And I'm not backing down." Roy studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "Then let's finish this." The two of them stepped back into the main office, and every head turned. Avery felt their eyes, their whispers, but she didn't let it shake her. She moved through the space with purpose, knowing that the real work was just beginning. Malik caught up to her near the exit. "You sure you're ready for this?" Avery paused, meeting his gaze. "I've never been more ready." Outside, the night was colder than before, the wind cutting sharp against her skin. She didn't mind. The burn on her cheek no longer felt like a wound, it felt like a reminder. A reminder of what she had endured. And what she had survived. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or broken. And Avery Daniels wasn't going to stop until every last one of them was heard. The door behind her slammed shut, and as the echoes faded into the night, Avery took her first step forward. The station buzzed with an uneasy energy. Conversations hummed in low voices, cut off the moment Avery Daniels stepped into view. She could feel their stares prickling against her back, curious, nervous, maybe even resentful. The fallout was already starting. She could see it in the way officers shifted when she passed, their eyes darting away as if looking at her too long might make them guilty by association. Avery didn't slow her steps. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her hesitate. Every step was deliberate, her heels clicking against the tile floor, sharp and purposeful. Malik walked beside her, his posture tense but steady. He was the only one who hadn't flinched, the only one who had stood by her when everything had started to unravel. "You feel it, don't you?" Malik said under his breath. Avery didn't look at him. "Feel what?" "The shift," he replied. "The way they're looking at you now. It's not just curiosity. It's fear." "Good," she said flatly. Malik glanced at her. "Is it?" She stopped, turning to face him. "It should be. Fear keeps people in check." Malik shook his head. "Fear also makes people reckless." Avery's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Captain Roy Edwards appeared at the end of the hall. His expression was hard to read, stern, maybe even wary, but not surprised. He'd been doing this long enough to know when the ground beneath him was shifting. "We need to talk," Roy said, his voice low. Avery motioned for Malik to stay back, then followed Roy into the conference room. The door closed with a sharp click, and the sound of the station faded away, leaving only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above them. Roy leaned against the table, arms crossed. "You're in deeper than you think." Avery didn't flinch. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Roy shook his head. "You don't get it. Hale wasn't acting alone. You took him down, but the people who protected him? They're still here. And they're not happy. I didn't come here to make friends." "No, but you came here to change things. And if you're not careful, you're going to get buried before you even get started." Avery stepped closer. "Let them try." Roy's eyes hardened. "You think I'm trying to scare you? I think you're trying to stop me." Roy straightened, his shoulders squaring. "If I wanted to stop you, Daniels, I would have let Hale keep his badge." Avery didn't back down. "Then why are we having this conversation?" "Because I want you to survive this," Roy said. "And you won't if you keep walking into the fire without looking for the exits." Avery stared at him, her pulse steady. "Maybe I don't need an exit." Roy sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're going to make this harder than it has to be, aren't you?" If it were easy, someone would have done it already. The room fell into silence, and for the first time, Roy looked like he might believe her. Or maybe he was just tired of arguing. Either way, he finally nodded. "Fine," he said. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Avery pushed the door open and stepped back into the station. The noise returned in an instant, phones ringing, chairs scraping, voices murmuring, but it felt different now. She didn't hesitate as she walked through the room, and this time, she didn't stop to see who was watching. Malik fell into step beside her again. "How'd it go?" he asked. "He's with us," Avery said, her voice sharp but quiet. Malik exhaled. "For now." Avery stopped at the edge of the station, turning to face him. "Then we make it count." Malik's eyes searched hers. "What if it's not enough?" "It has to be." She pushed open the doors and stepped outside. The cold air hit her like a slap, but she welcomed it. The sting on her cheek had dulled, but the memory hadn't. It never would. Roy had been right about one thing, Hale wasn't the only one. Avery had known that the moment she saw the hesitation in Malik's eyes, the way other officers had lingered, watching but doing nothing. They weren't just bystanders. They were part of it. The real fight hadn't even started yet. Her phone buzzed, and she pulled it from her pocket, half expecting bad news. Instead, it was Malik. "Malik, you good?" "Avery, define good." "Malik, still breathing?" "Avery, for now." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and leaned against her car, staring up at the dark sky. The clouds hung heavy, like the storm hadn't passed yet. Because it hadn't. A car pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the night. Avery didn't move as it stopped near the entrance. Two officers stepped out, their eyes flicking toward her before disappearing inside. She wasn't imagining it anymore. They were watching her. But she didn't look away. She let them see her. Let them know she wasn't going anywhere. The door to the station swung open again, and Roy stepped outside, his hands shoved into his pockets. He paused when he saw her, then walked over. "Couldn't leave without another warning?" she asked. Roy didn't smile. "No warnings. Just facts." "Like what?" "Like the fact that you're going to have to fight for every inch from now on." Avery nodded. "I know." Roy hesitated. "And you're ready for that?" Avery's voice was steady. "I was born ready." Roy shook his head, but there was something close to respect in his eyes. "Just make sure you don't burn out before you finish what you started," he said. Avery watched him walk back inside, her jaw tightening. She wouldn't burn out. She couldn't. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone Hale had ever stepped on. Everyone who had stayed silent because they thought no one would believe them. And Avery Daniels wasn't done yet. Avery sat in the dimly lit office, her back straight, her hands pressed against the cool surface of the table. The weight of the night pressed down on her, heavier than before. She could still hear the echoes of Hale's shouts from earlier, the sound of the cuffs locking around his wrists, the crack in his voice when reality finally sank in. But the victory felt thin, like a fragile sheet of glass, ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. The door opened, and Malik stepped inside, his eyes scanning her face. He shut the door behind him, leaning against it like he was trying to catch his breath. "You all right?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Avery didn't look at him. "I'm still here." Malik exhaled, running a hand over his face. "You shouldn't be. Not right now." "Why?" Her voice was sharper than she intended, but she didn't soften it. "Because they're watching me. Because they're already lining up to make sure I fail." Malik didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Because they're scared of you. And scared people do dangerous things." Avery's eyes met his. "Good. He shook his head. No. It's not good. You're not hearing me. Hale might be in cuffs, but his people. They're still here. And they're already making calls. You don't think they're going to let this go, do you? No, she said quietly. I don't. Malik stepped closer, lowering his voice. Then you need to be smart about this. You think Roy's going to keep backing you when the pressure starts coming down? I don't need Roy. Malik let out a sharp breath, pacing to the other side of the room. That's the problem, Avery. You don't think you need anyone. She pushed back from the table, standing so suddenly that the chair scraped against the floor. I didn't need anyone to survive tonight, she said, her voice shaking now. I didn't need anyone to stop him when she stopped, swallowing hard. Malik froze, his eyes locked on hers. I know. No, you don't. Avery's voice cracked. You saw it, but you didn't stop it. No one did. Malik stepped closer, but she held up a hand to stop him. I don't need anyone to fight my battles for me, Malik, she said, her voice softer now. But if you're here, if you're really here, then I need to know you're not going to run when this gets worse. Malik's jaw tightened. I'm not going anywhere. For the first time, Avery let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But before either of them could say more, there was a knock at the door. Roy stepped inside, his face unreadable as always. You need to come with me. Avery's stomach tightened. Why? Roy hesitated, his gaze flicking to Malik before settling back on her. We found something. Malik's shoulders tensed. What kind of something? Roy didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, motioning for them to follow. The hallway felt colder as they walked. Avery could feel the stares, the whispers, but she didn't look at anyone. She focused on Roy's back, the sound of her own footsteps, the hum of the lights overhead. When they reached the evidence room, Roy stopped and turned. This just came in. Avery stepped past him, her eyes immediately drawn to the box sitting on the table. It was small, unmarked, but the weight of it filled the room. Malik stood beside her. What is it? Roy opened the lid, revealing a folder and a flash drive. It's from Hale's locker, Roy said. Avery reached for the folder, but Roy caught her hand. You need to be ready for what's in here, he said. Her heart pounded. I already am. She pulled out the contents, flipping through the papers. Each page hit her like a punch, records, logs, payments, names. The web stretched farther than she'd imagined. This wasn't just him, Malik said, his voice hollow. Avery didn't respond. She kept flipping, her breath quickening as the pieces fell into place. It's a network, Roy said quietly. Avery looked up. And they're still out there. Roy nodded. And they're going to come after you now that you've taken him out. She closed the folder, her hands shaking slightly. Let them. Roy stepped closer. Avery, no, she cut him off. I mean it. They've already come after me once. They think I'm scared of them. I'm not. Roy's eyes softened, but his voice stayed firm. This isn't just about you anymore. I know that, Avery said. Malik stepped closer. Then let's do this right. No more risks. No more walking in blind. Avery hesitated, but finally nodded. Fine. But we move now. Roy exhaled. We will. But first, he looked at the box. We clean this place out. Every last one of them. The tension in the room shifted, tightening like a rope. Avery could feel it, the weight of everything they were about to do, the risks they were about to take. But she didn't back down. She looked at Malik, then at Roy. No more looking the other way. Roy met her eyes. No more. As they left the room, the hum of the station grew louder. Officers watched them pass, their expressions unreadable. Avery didn't slow, didn't falter. Because no matter what came next, she wasn't walking away. And she wasn't backing down. The hallway felt longer than it had before, like the walls were closing in with every step Avery took. Her fingers tightened around the folder in her hand, the edges digging into her skin, but she didn't loosen her grip. She couldn't. Not after what she had just seen. Malik walked beside her, his shoulders squared, but she could tell by the tension in his jaw that he was thinking the same thing she was. This wasn't over. Not even close. Roy's voice cut through the silence as they reached his office. We need to be careful how we handle this. Avery stopped, turning to face him. Careful got us here. Careful let them get away with it for years. Roy closed the door behind them and leaned against the desk. And rushing into this is going to get people hurt. Avery's eyes didn't leave his. People are already hurt. Roy exhaled, rubbing his temples. You're not wrong, but this isn't just one bad cop anymore. This is the entire system we're talking about. That's exactly why we can't stop now, Avery said. Malik stepped forward. She's right. Roy's gaze flicked between them, his jaw tightening. You don't get it. I've seen this before. I've seen what happens when you go after people like this. They don't just roll over. They fight back. Then let them fight, Avery said, her voice steady. Roy shook his head. You think you're ready for that? I don't think, she shot back. I know. Roy stared at her for a long moment before finally pushing away from the desk. Fine. But you're going to do it my way. No more shortcuts. No more risking everything without a plan. Avery didn't move. We're wasting time. Roy's voice dropped. Do you want this to work, or do you just want revenge? Avery's breath caught, but she didn't let it show. I want both. Malik stepped between them. Enough. We can't do this here. Roy backed off, but the tension didn't ease. Avery turned to Malik. What did you find in the rest of the files? Malik hesitated before pulling out a second folder. Names. Accounts. Payments. It's deeper than we thought. Roy leaned in, scanning the documents. This isn't just dirty cops. This is organized. Avery's voice hardened. And it all ties back to Hale. Roy nodded. And if we go after them, we're going to need backup. Malik looked at Avery. Who do you trust? She didn't answer right away. The truth was, trust wasn't something she had left. Not here. Not anymore. Roy must have seen it in her face. You don't have to do this alone. I know. But the words felt hollow. Malik stepped closer. Then let's go. They moved quickly, the air growing heavier with every step. Avery's heartbeat picked up, but her focus sharpened. She wasn't thinking about what came next, only about getting there. The evidence room was cold, the smell of old paper and chemicals lingering in the air. Malik started sorting through the files while Roy locked the door behind them. Avery reached for another folder, but Malik grabbed her wrist. Wait. She froze, her eyes snapping to his. What? Malik's expression was tight. This isn't just about Hale. Avery's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Malik handed her a file, and her eyes scanned the pages. It wasn't just records. It was surveillance, photos, timestamps, reports. And her name was all over it. They've been watching you, Malik said. Avery's pulse quickened. For how long? Long enough, Roy said, his voice grim. Avery closed the file, her fingers trembling slightly. This doesn't change anything. It changes everything, Roy snapped. They're already ahead of us. You think this ends with Hale? It doesn't. Avery's voice hardened. We knew this wouldn't be easy. Malik stepped in. Yeah, but we didn't know it would be this dangerous. Avery's eyes met his. I did. Malik hesitated, then nodded. All right. Then we finish this. Roy's voice softened. Just be ready for what comes next. Avery turned back to the files, her hands steadying as she flipped through the pages. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they painted wasn't any clearer. It was darker, messier, more dangerous. And it was far from over. They left the room in silence, the weight of what they'd uncovered pressing down harder with every step. The station was quieter now, but the tension hadn't eased. It had just changed, shifted into something sharper. Avery could feel the eyes following her again, but this time, it wasn't just curiosity. It was something more dangerous. Roy stopped her near the exit. Are you sure you're ready for this? Avery didn't hesitate. I don't have a choice. Roy's expression softened, but his voice stayed firm. You always have a choice. Avery stepped outside before he could say more, the cold air hitting her like a wall. Malik followed, his footsteps heavy against the pavement. You really think we can do this? He asked quietly. Avery turned to him, her voice steady. We have to. Malik nodded, but the doubt lingered in his eyes. Then let's make sure we don't screw it up. Avery's lips pressed together. We won't. But as she looked back at the station, the shadows stretching across the parking lot, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part hadn't even started yet. And she wasn't sure if any of them were ready for it. The morning light poured through the station windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Avery Daniels stood near the front desk, her back straight, her eyes scanning the room. It felt different now, quieter, heavier, like the building itself had taken a breath and was still waiting to exhale. Officers moved cautiously, their conversations hushed, their glances quick and unsure. The fallout had started. Hale's arrest had sent shockwaves through the department, and the cracks in the foundation were finally showing. Roy stood near the corner, speaking quietly to another officer, his expression hard. Malik approached Avery, his steps slow, his face carrying the weight of the night they'd survived. It's done, Malik said softly, sliding a folder onto the desk in front of her. Avery opened it, her eyes scanning the signatures. Resignations. 10 of them. Officers who had been connected to Hale's network either directly or through quiet complicity. They're out, Malik added. Avery closed the folder, her hands steady. Not all of them. Malik hesitated. No. But it's a start. She nodded, but her eyes stayed sharp. We keep digging. Malik's voice dropped. Avery, no, she cut him off. We don't stop. Not until every last one of them is out of this building. Malik exhaled, then nodded. I'm with you. Before Avery could respond, the front doors swung open. 2 officers escorted Hale inside, his wrists cuffed, his face pale but hardened. He didn't look at her as they led him through the station, but she felt the weight of his presence all the same. Roy stepped beside her, his voice low. They're transferring him now. Federal charges. Avery's eyes stayed on Hale. Good. Roy shifted slightly. He's been asking for you. She didn't flinch. Let him wait. Hale's footsteps faded as the doors closed behind him. The room seemed to breathe again, but Avery didn't. Not yet. Malik leaned in. You sure you're okay? Avery turned to him, her voice steady but sharp. Ask me when this is really over. Hours later, the station began to empty. Roy lingered in his office, going over files. Malik packed up his desk but didn't leave. Avery stood outside, the cold air biting at her skin as she leaned against the railing. She could still feel the burn on her cheek, but it no longer hurt. It had become a reminder, a mark of survival. Roy eventually stepped out, his coat slung over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw her. "You should go home," he said. Avery didn't move. "Not yet." Roy studied her for a moment, then stepped closer. "You did good today." She looked at him. "We're not done." "No," Roy admitted. "But we started something." Avery nodded. "And now we finish it." Roy's eyes softened, but his voice stayed firm. "You can't fix everything overnight." "Maybe not," she said. "But I can make sure no one forgets what happened here." Roy hesitated, then offered a small nod. "Just don't lose yourself in this." Avery held his gaze. "I already found myself." Roy didn't argue. Instead, he stepped back, leaving her alone with the night. Malik appeared a moment later, hands in his pockets. "You ever think about walking away?" he asked. Avery didn't look at him. "No," Malik smirked slightly. "Didn't think so." He leaned against the railing beside her, the silence stretching. Finally, he spoke again. "What happens now?" Avery exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold. "We rebuild." "And what if it doesn't work?" Her eyes stayed on the horizon. "Then we rebuild again." Malik nodded, falling silent. The weight of what they'd started hung between them, but so did the resolve. The sound of the station door opening pulled Avery's attention back. A young officer stepped out, hesitating before approaching. "Detective Daniels?" She turned. "Yeah." He swallowed nervously. I wanted to say thank you. For what you did." Avery's chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Don't thank me yet." The officer nodded and stepped away. Malik watched him go, then looked back at Avery. "You're already making them believe again." Avery didn't answer. She didn't need to. The city stretched out before her, the lights flickering in the distance. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe. The storm hadn't passed. She knew that. But the ground beneath her feet felt solid for the first time in a long time. And she wasn't going to let it crumble again. This story isn't just about justice, it's about resilience. About standing up even when you've been pushed down too many times to count. Avery Daniels wasn't perfect, but she didn't break. And neither should you. Because the truth is, the world isn't always fair. It doesn't always hand you the justice you deserve. Sometimes, you have to take it. And sometimes, you have to fight for it. So let this story remind you of that fight. Let it remind you that your voice matters, that your strength matters. And most importantly, let it remind you that no one, absolutely no one, can take your worth away from you. Now, we want to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? Did it resonate with you? Drop a comment below and let's keep this conversation going. And if you want more stories like this, stories that make you think, feel, and maybe even fight, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button, share this video, and join us next time for another powerful story. Because every twist has a lesson. And every lesson has the power to change the world.